All right. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. Today is the fourth day of the summit, and we have here with us Jeremy Treadwell, the president and COO of Treadwell Agency, who is going to present to us anticipating the future and strengthening app security through developer-centric foresight. Over to you, Jeremy. Thanks a
Hello,
lot.
hello. Thank you so very much for that warm introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Treadwell, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all today about developer-centric foresight, how it truly has the ability to help your organization, help your security, and your development groups work well together, partner, and drive success through the organization. So, what are we going to talk about today? Why are we here? So, I always put my kind of key lessons up front, which hopefully is what drew you into this talk in the first place. First item is to learn how an application security teams can enhance collaboration between security and development. Secondly, is to explore the shift from a reactive cybersecurity approach to a proactive one, and how foresight can really help change how your organization views your process by which you make the organization resilient. Thirdly, to take a deep dive into how economic decision making impacts secure coding practices. And really, I want to highlight here how dark actors or understanding threat actors, how their economic impacts your organization and the business as a whole. And then lastly, investigate the intersections of developer tools and security protocols inspired by human computer interaction principles. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to highlight the benefits of driving security culture into your organization, benefits the business, the development, and the overall security of your product or application. Without further ado, I want to introduce myself just a little bit. I am a information security founder. My name is Jeremy Treadwell, and I own and created Treadwell Agency. We focus on the human element of cybersecurity and driving foresight into cybersecurity, having better conversations about long-range resiliency. My background is I have an undergraduate degree in computer science and multimedia from Bradley University, where I am also currently an adjunct professor. I just finished my master's degree from Michigan State University, and I am most recently a fellow at the Institute of Technology at Virginia Tech. We're exploring the intersection of the technology and the humanities and how that can be used to drive the future of the workforce, of industry, of innovation, of a lot of different things. My background is that I've worked as a digital strategist, product, cybersecurity, technology lead across multiple platforms, over 15 years of experience working across various domains, all towards the goal of creating seamless user interaction and security for organizations. And lastly, my hobbies focus around traveling. I'm planning a trip right now to India for a wedding at the top of the year. I love reading. I'm always juggling 3 to 5 books between audiobooks and physical books. And let's just say the fellowship at Virginia Tech is giving me a lot to read. I love boxing, so go Anthony Joshua. And then golf is a relatively new hobby that I picked up during the pandemic. But watching videos, understanding form and technique is taking up a lot of my time. So that's a little bit about me. So I always like to start with the first portion, as we talked about, the empathy connection. And as I see the GIF here, loading empathy. In this case, I really want to talk about two aspects, right? The first one is understanding developer mindsets, and then secondly, understanding security mindsets. So when I talk about understanding developer mindsets, it's a focus point on, as we know, developers, and I am a developer myself, we are trained to do specific tasks, solve problems, drive value into the organization through sprints, through releases, through pushing code, pushing features that the business has determined valuable, right? Quite rarely do we get a chance to focus on the strategy of what we're building. Most likely developers are extremely focused on delivering that productivity, delivering that functionality into the platform as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So obviously those are the 3 bullet points, right? So the first one is being that problem solver, diving into the technical feasibility, understanding what the business is trying to solve. As a developer, I've had many conversations with the business, with stakeholders, with product leaders, with all sorts of individuals asking if they can do something on a website or on a platform, whatever you may be building, and prioritizing the ability to problem solve, to find technical solutions. I recall in one instance, I was working in Cold Fusion and building a database through XML. And I actually was at the laundromat when I had a mental breakthrough with regards to how to traverse a set of data, both top down and bottom up using XML. And so I actually had a piece of paper with me or a notebook, and I started writing out XML code by hand. And like, oh, I could traverse it this way, and then I could parse it through JSON another way. Um, so the idea is that even when we're not coding, our brains are still problem solving. And I think that's very much the mindset of a developer. The second function here is a technical approach. Again, in order to solve the problem, we need to understand the technical confines of the system in which we're building. So understanding and prioritizing the approach that the business needs in order to solve this particular problem, in order to technically execute within the time frame. As developers, we often are thrust with a user story that the company wants to include in this next sprint, and then we have to estimate how long that will take, which takes a very technical approach to be able to say, well, okay, this could take 4 hours, this could take 8 hours, and be able to dissect the functions and how long that will take. So the mindset of a developer is a very technical one, but also one that's oriented towards understanding the scope of possibility and probability in what it is that we're developing. So understand if we're doing JSON or GET or push requests, or crafting an entire API connection, right? Establishing the keys, establishing a session ID. A number of technical componentry is required for a developer to process the user story into what could be defined as technical. Well, I wouldn't call it acceptance criteria, but the technical steps in order to achieve the story that was defined. And then the third function that most developers have as a mindset is that speed and efficiency. Again, developers are frequently asked, well, how long will this take? Or how long will that take? And we need to be able to, hopefully with some degree of certainty, and the more you develop, the more you have a keen sense of how to do so, prioritize efficiency and speed in being able to determine how long a particular function will take, and understanding the connected parts. If I'm designing a function that has multiple parts and will maybe use separately, I may, instead of building a monolith, I may think to build microservices where they're individual functioning pieces, but they can be kind of daisy chained together in order to achieve the desired function, but also can be called independently as well. So that really summarizes the mindset of a developer. By no means is this an exhaustive list, but I wanted to highlight a few core elements of the mindset of a developer. And now I want to go into understanding a security mindset. Oftentimes, these mindsets are often far apart because they're concerned about two very different things. They are judged by two very different things. Work compensation and pay scales are determined by two very different things. Oftentimes, developers are viewed as a small group or individual contributor function, right? As each developer is assigned a set of tasks at the start of each sprint, whereas security often is viewed as a collaboration, often intertwined with IT and all the various functions of a security, whether that be physical protection, digital protection, asset protection. Like there's IT, there's a lot of pieces that meld together to create security. So when I talk about security mindsets, I would say first and foremost, it is a compliance focused. A lot of times security groups understand that they are beholden to certain laws and regulations, which if not followed, open the organization up to an immense amount of scrutiny. If you guys read the news, Penn State just recently got into an issue. The US government recently rolled out a Whistleblowers Protection Act, which means the CIO of Penn State blew the whistle that Penn State was not compliant, even though they said they were. And in this Protection Act, the whistleblower themselves is entitled to 1/3 of the contract value. And if the contract or if the breach value, so to speak, proves to be true, then what's the word I'm looking for? Then the consequence of such is 3 times the value. So let's just say Penn State had a $3 million contract on the line. They said they were compliant with a certain set of criteria. Turns out the whistleblower said they were not. So that means the fine could be $9 million, 3 times the $3 million value. And then the whistleblower is entitled to 1/3 of the damages, which means that is equal to the contract value. So the whistleblower can walk away with $3 million because they blew the whistle on the organization for not being compliant. And that's a critical thing to think about. The second function that a lot of security professionals have as a mindset is to avoid risk. Not risk does not equal risk. The goal is to minimize, avoid potential risks and vulnerabilities in systems and processes. Of course, with a fast-paced moving organization, it's not always easy to navigate that, but the goal is to minimize risk at all times. And then thirdly, I would say the preventative approach. The goal, of course, of any security department or function is to prioritize proactive measures to prevent security breaches rather than relying on reactive responses. A lot of times we live in a reactive organization, meaning we put preliminary defenses in place, and if something gets through, there is a scramble to try to save, try to manipulate, try to do whatever we can to protect the organization and the data. And oftentimes this includes, say, the competitive advantage, right? If there's an app or a software or emails or memos or intellectual property that could be potentially leaked through not having access to this. So a couple of examples to bridge the gap between the security mindset and the developer mindset, and just 2 ideas, and we'll go a little bit deeper, but I want to highlight here monthly code reviews is one example that I've seen functional. Developers and security experts collaborate to assess code for vulnerabilities. What this means is after maybe 1, 2, or 3 sprints, the development team and or the security team could look at the codes that were pushed out in releases and being able to select a chunk of code to actually talk through to understand how this impacts the organization, if there are any specific vulnerabilities that can be observed. A lot of times pen testing is what's used from a security standpoint to see if the code is secure. But understanding if you have pen testers in your organization or if it's a third party, inviting them into this code reviews usually is an example of a proactive approach. Usually pen testing is done after the fact, after we have the software built. Pen testing, or should I say monthly code reviews, is a way to incorporate a preventative approach in reviewing your code and reviewing and honestly building the relationship between the developers and the security team. And then the other option I wanted to discuss briefly is the cross-training workshops. And this is a way to organize workshops where developers and security professionals can gain insights into the other's process. Imagine, if you will, during a sprint planning conversation, you have security in the room. And as you discuss functions and for whom this function is available, power users, traditional users, et cetera, then you could potentially highlight security impacts across the way. When we talk about insider threats and other things of that nature, we want to have security in the room to not necessarily add to the work, but potentially minimize the work, right? And remove function or functionality that could expose the organization to liability or create a more secure pipeline. I find that the more engineering is aware, the more security is aware of the upcoming functions of any given platform or app or SaaS model, if you will, then there is a greater opportunity to enhance the proactive approach to how the firewalls are established, the extended, XDRs, and endpoint detection systems, et cetera, to understand the key differentiators on how to drive that throughout the organization. So let's talk a little bit about the second point, which was proactive versus reactive security. And no one wants to be Urkel and say, oops, did I do that? So I would love to, if there's anyone in the room, do a little bit of a chat. Do a little bit of a poll. In the chat, please answer A through F if you find any of these to be true. If you identify, what do you identify as the most significant risk to secure development in your organization? Is it A, insufficient security training? B, inadequate integration of security and development? C, increasing environment complexity, whether that means a cloud, on-prem and cloud and backup storage, lots of options there. D, a shortage of focus on emerging threats. E, rapidly evolving zero-day vulnerabilities. Or F, balancing security protocols and rapid development cycles, meaning there's so much going on between the two groups, it's hard to even get a clear image. So if you can, please feel free to think about this and answer in the chat room. Let's see a couple of answers coming in. A lot of people are saying A, insufficient security training. So I appreciate your input. And that's something to think about within your organization. Someone else is saying B and F, which is inadequate integration of security development and balancing security protocols and rapid development cycles. And we'll talk a little bit about ways to mitigate some of these concerns throughout the rest of this presentation. But going into this next segment,
so just a quick one. Sorry, hey, Dennis here. If you go back, for me is actually a mix of C and an F, which is actually, but you kind of mix. I think on F you mixed a bit, because I would say for me is the complexity environments and the rapid development cycles, right? There's which basically means is the business accelerating and pushing, growing and building, basically adding a huge amount of complexity to our environment.
Understood. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that feedback. So okay, the one thing I want to highlight, and we talk about like developer-centric foresight, it's absolutely critical to understand one thing. So I am a certified futurist. That's one thing I think I forgot to mention part of my bio. And when I was studying foresight and going through my certification process, we learned something absolutely critical about the human mind. Researchers put an individual in an MRI machine and asked them to think about themselves today, current state, what they have to do today, what they want to eat for lunch, all of those questions. To which the prefrontal cortex, right in the front center here, lit up like a Christmas tree, showing all the neuron activities in the brain and how it lights up when you think about yourself in today, in the moment. Researchers, also with individuals in the MRI machine, asked people to think about themselves a year from now, or a year and a half from now, maybe even 2 years from now. And ironically enough,
hey, Jeremy, we're still only seeing the green animation. Is that the one, or you have another one?
That's the same one.
Okay, cool. Okay, sorry, because you mentioned the front cortex. I thought, cool. No,
yeah.
continue.
So during this process, the researchers found that the prefrontal cortex did not light up as much at all during asking people to think about their future selves. And so, of course, more research has been done, and we find now that the concept of thinking about your future self is actually a muscle that you can build. When we are, and I'm sure we've all seen the viral videos of a parent putting a sweet treat in front of a child and saying, hey, I'll be right back. Don't eat this. And if you don't eat it, when I get back, I'll give you double, or I'll give you something else sweet. Of course, we know that as a concept of delayed gratification. So when we talk about one's understanding of foresight, which is the ability to make decisions not just based on today's knowledge, but planning for and in anticipation of a preferred or better future, which means that over time, myself included, we all can strengthen that connection, which means we'll have a better ability to make delayed gratification decisions, but also this is immediately applicable to our organizations. So this section, I want to highlight foresight, what it means to drive conversations around the future of a development of organization, of yourself. And a couple of key concepts I want to highlight in kind of a vocabulary of the future. We're going to talk about these just a touch, because when I say developer-centric foresight, I want you to understand what I mean by that. So the first vocabulary word we're going to talk about is a signal. A signal is just what it means. When someone's ahead of you and they put on their turn signal, it's an indicator of change. It's letting you know that they are about to turn right or left, in the middle lane, in the intersection, at a stoplight, at a red light, whatever that may mean. Signals typically are early indicators or shifts or developments in a situation. We've looked at signals potentially of the war in Iraq. We've looked at the signals of the pandemic. We've looked at signals across the board, across every area with enough research. And of course, there are items that don't necessarily give us signals. But for the most part, if we look hard enough, we can find signals of almost any significant change. Second one on this list is the drivers of change. And these are different than signals, because if I can observe a signal, I can also do research to understand the mindsets, the behaviors, the value sets, anything that might have created that change. One example might be, we see several countries shifting away from the American dollar as an example. That could be viewed as a signal. That is the change, right? They are moving towards a different or unified or diversified currency. A driver of that change could be socioeconomic pressures. It could be tariffs. It could be political connections and relationships between countries. Another example could be the shift or the signal towards cryptocurrency, towards a distributed ledger of financial value, as opposed to being dependent on an individual country's definition of value and regulation and taxation of currency. And the driver of that change might be we live in a global economy, and that individuals want greater say or access or control over their currency. Similar to the stock market, people are investing in cryptocurrency or crypto coins to be able to establish that value and be able to grow that value based on the theory of change and based on kind of a mass theory. Everyone's investing in this particular coin, and now this coin is worth, I think, is like the last I checked, like $50,000 for one blockchain coin. The third vocabulary word we want to talk about today is megatrends. These are grown up signals. Megatrends have evolved from early stage signals into large, major patterns that significantly influence our society and culture. One example might be mask wearing. All right, it started off as a signal, and it grew into a megatrend. And I still see individuals in the U.S. Wearing masks, surprising as that may seem, because the pandemic is not completely gone here. And we see that is represented across multiple nations that opt for safety and security through mask wearing. And that has become a trend. And if we understand the drivers of that trend or mega trend, going back one step, we can look at health, safety, we can look at smog, environmental concerns. So there's a couple of things that we can identify as the driver of a signal and a mega trend, which can help us understand how to alter and manipulate the next steps for our organizations. And the last thing I want to highlight is scenarios. Scenarios are alternative narratives that explore potential future situations and outcomes. So understanding, one example, I have a colleague who during, I think it was 2008, the United States had an Ebola outbreak, which was handled under the Obama administration. During that time, my colleague was doing cybersecurity planning and strategy for a major financial institution. And a part of that conversation and what they call a tabletop exercise, she was able to work with them to explore what happens if 50% of our workforce becomes incapacitated. And the executives were like, no, that would never happen. But they did have a tabletop exercise. And as a result of that, the organization was able to make critical decisions and documents, what we call playbooks, that would determine and guide how they would react, right, in that moment. So it's not that they were reactionary, they were proactive in understanding what they would do were this scenario to actually play out. And they had a book so that when the pandemic did hit, which of a completely different disease, mind you, they actually had a playbook. They knew what they wanted to do. They had established who the critical infrastructure was. They established who the critical employees were. They had created a protocol and a system for remote working. They understood how to navigate such a thing because they were prepared and because they had a scenario with that in mind. So to understand how all of these play together, I'm putting a lot of the same words to the far left, and I want to create a mental graph for you to connect the dots. So we've all read potentially, say, George Orwell or Ayn Rand. We understand the kind of dystopian novel. Some of us might have even read Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard. Understanding science fiction. There's a lot of Dune, there's a lot, Mars, there's tons of science fiction throughout the lexicon of the history of the world. And I think a lot of science fiction truly holds truth. And I like to think of these as scenarios in which the world could exist, the decisions and a pattern of change that very much could happen so that that world depicted in the science fiction could come to fruition. And often these times in wild cards, if you guys aren't familiar, the United States, state of California recently had a mild hurricane, but during the hurricane, they had an earthquake, and the news dubbed it here an hurricane. And again, these are wild cards. These are things that we could not prepare for or anticipate. Events, the surprise, act of God changes that no one did see coming, right? That just happened. Now, could we have seen them coming? Have we had the right signals and understood that? Possibly. But wild cards are typically not signals, but these are, kind of horizon events or 0-day events that we weren't either prepared for or anticipated in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of these come from the state of imagination. So when we look at science fiction, wild cards, or weak signals, all of these come from either what we think or what we could know or try to understand, or using our imagination, such as all of the examples I gave around the science fiction books. Now, when we understand weak signals, disruptions, and scenarios, I've explained signals. So weak signals are just that, weak signals, like meaning we've barely got a whisper. Understanding of what it is or why or drivers of that change aren't clear. Disruptions are usually a shift in the industry, which often catches the industry by surprise. Think about Uber to the taxi industry. So that's considered a disruption. Could the taxi industry have known about this and prevented it and prepared themselves for a future of technology using the internet? Possibly. We have Curb, there are other platforms, but generally and by and large, that's considered a disruption. And scenarios also in the same vein, those three roughly fall into a horizon scanning bucket, which means we're starting to understand and pay attention to what's happening in the world around us across the globe and close to home. Horizon scanning is a critical component to understand what's happening in our world and how we can understand what's happening and why it's happening in order to safeguard our organization. Similarly, to do the same, your organization could track all of the cyber threats and cyber hacks that's happening across the globe to bring that into your organization and say, hey, if this exact same attack vector was taken on our organization, would we have survived or would we have been penetrated? And then looking further up, scenarios, change drivers, and trends, this is when we start to look at finding alternatives. So scenarios specifically and trends help us view the world from a different standpoint, not just what is, but what could be based on what we're seeing. And as weak signals grow into trends and trends go into mega trends, we can start to see the impact of a change. And if we were able to understand the change drivers behind that change, then we can allow all of these pieces to work together to allow us to see the bigger picture. Now, this is really important subsection to highlight here, because as we talk about the next sections, this is the only section that's not focused on developers or security. It's focused on foresight, because I want you to kind of bring back to your organization, we should be looking at the now very, very closely, but we should also have maybe a few individuals that are focused on the future, focused on signals of change, focused on drivers of change, and focused on bringing that back to our organization to stress test what's happening in the world across our organization to see if our organization has the processes, protocols, tools, resources, individuals, you can name a lot of things here, to protect the organization. So when we talk a little bit about reactive security versus proactive security, highlighting this, the idea that most cybers focus on reactive in the sense of we establish the baseline, and then if something happens, we're all focused on reacting to the threat that's happened or the risk to the organization. Take the most recent MGM Grand and Caesar's Palace cyber attack, ransomware. In the event of they are losing $3+ million per day because of this threat and because of this ransomware. And in a sense, they're very reactionary. They did pay the ransom to regain control and access to their data, but there was no guarantee that they would resume that, right? And in those ransomware situations, you pay via cryptocurrency and those funds are almost never recoverable. So you have no assurances, and I'm not sure who negotiated the deal. I'm not on the inside of that, just outside looking in. I want to highlight how reactive security causes damage to an organization. So incident-driven response is typically very high when you have a reactive security organization. It means that the business is prioritizing the business, prioritizing potentially the users or the outcomes they're trying to achieve. And security is left to defend the business as it's moving forward in a way that exposes the business to more vulnerability and risk. So relatively high in this category to me is an incident-driven response, which means you're only measuring and evaluating your security protocols either annually or based on new knowledge, based on other attack vectors, or what you're learning about the organization once it's already public, right? So you may do your pen testing after you do a release of a particular product or SaaS or application. That to me is incident-driven and reactionary. Another piece is patch management, right? You push a release and then you have to patch it. You push the release and then you have to patch it, right? It's reactive in the sense that you're doing after it's already been available to the public, or you're starting to see people attacking certain vectors in your network and you realize that you have a vulnerability and then you seek to patch it. And then thirdly is continuous monitoring. Also, the idea that you have individuals or have a SOC or a team that's continuously monitoring the network. But again, they're monitoring the network for penetration attacks. Then they review the attacks that have already happened, which means you still have an understanding that there are vulnerabilities, there are things that you are either working on patching or have yet to patch, and therefore you need to monitor those areas most closely. As opposed to a proactive security mindset, which allows developers and the security team to work together to create a proactive approach in mitigating risks and vulnerabilities to the organization. First things first, the incident-driven response goes way down because you've positioned the organization, you've previewed, you've tested most of the releases that are happening on the public side of the application or website or SaaS. What that means also is that your patch management also goes down by writing test scripts that will use the latest intel from what attacks are happening in the wild, in the industry, in the global workforce of all of the threat actors. You're able to minimize the patches you have to release because you've been able to take that data in and incorporated it to pre-release and worked closely with the developers to ensure that these gaps are tight-knit even before it goes into production. And then lastly, your continuous monitoring goes all the way up, primarily not because you're monitoring for existing vulnerabilities or pre-patched concerns, You're instead looking at and analyzing external threats. So if you were able to get I've seen articles that do this, it's a play-by-play of the MGM Grand and Caesar's Palace attack. If you're able to analyze what was done, and I think there was some insider threat there as well, capturing those details, threat by threat, hack by hack, ransomware by ransomware, bring that back into your organization and play that out in your internal systems to determine if there is vulnerability within your organization.
Can I just add a comment on the past on that page? One of the things that I do, which I think works really well, is to taking that instance-driven response like to another level. Is I tend to escalate a lot of P2s for the business as P1s in security. So it's almost like we not only we focus and spend a lot of time and resources on particular incidents because we build and fix a lot of things. What we also do is we practice a lot of the workflows. And that means then when something a bit more serious happening, you have a team that really knows how to respond to incidents. So it's kind of like we don't need our tabletop exercises to figure out certain things. We do that during, in a way, P3s and P2s.
Agreed. So when I say developer-centric or developer-based foresight, I'm highlighting the idea that bringing foresight into your organization, into your security and to your development partnership allows you to really mitigate a lot of that risk. And it has a couple of key features. One, anticipating vulnerabilities before they manifest. Two, incorporating security into the development process. And three, proactive risk mitigation for robust and secure application development. So very simply put, if you and the security team partner early on and discuss some of the items in the backlog, discuss some of the items in the current sprint or the next sprint, understand the business criteria, you'll be able to much easily minimize it's a website, minimize the potential vulnerabilities that your organization is facing. So, okay, now we're going to have a little bit of fun. I highlighted at the very beginning something about behavioral economics in decision making. And as I was thinking about this concern as a developer and as a security person, usually in two different worlds, I realized that neither one is truly to blame. And I say that with hopefully a lot of asterisks. The focus is understanding, one, how the business thinks, and two, how threat actors think. So one thing I learned is that in 2023, this year, the average cost of a data breach is around $4.45 million. This comes from IBM, who's been doing this data research, and it's showing a 15% increase over, I think, the past 3 years. It just says over 3 years, so I'm not sure if they anticipated projecting 15% higher in 3 years, or if they're saying it's going up 15% over the last 3 years. But the value of this data is going up and up and up. So I wanted to highlight that for a minute. As developers and as security professionals, I wanted to highlight what are the values of stealing this data? Like, why economically would this be big business? And I've had to shift my thinking from a hacker in a basement with a hoodie on to a professional organization that is designed and houses and hires hackers as like full-time employees that just go into work as a method to steal data. So cyber criminals and their organizations pursue various avenues for financial gain. First and foremost is data theft. As I've heard and as I've said, data is the new currency. So targeting valuable data such as personal information, payment credit cards, all of these, PII, health data. There's a lot of type of personal data theft that's happening, and often data mining as well, scraping the internet for various data points across a demographic or across an organization to understand that person better and understand what their vulnerabilities might be. The second one is around ransom payments, demanding payment, obviously, most likely in cryptocurrency. An untraceable transfer creates a direct impact to victims. So thinking about the millions of dollars that MGM Grand had to recently pay for their ransomware attack. And then thirdly, the sale of stolen information. Despite paying the $3 million for the release of their digital assets from MGM Grand, whatever data that the threat actor was able to obfuscate and steal from their digital systems, they could then go sell to a third party for additional sums of money, totaling potentially in the millions. Even as an example of that, stolen credit cards range from $5 to $10, adding to their profits. Mind you, they're not selling one stolen credit card, they're selling 30,000 stolen credit cards because they've attacked, obviously using MGM as an example, they're a hotel. They house your credit card information, oftentimes right on your key card. So depending on what systems they were able to penetrate, they might have had, if they have 30,000 hotel rooms, just as an example, they have 30,000 credit cards directly stored on their local servers that they can then go sell to other interested parties. And if they have data about who was in the hotel, that might be beneficial. They have data about the operations of the business, maybe emails, maybe memos, then other competitors could buy that data directly from the threat actor. So there are tons of economic incentives, and we have to start thinking about hacking not as a kid in a basement, but as a big business, as an industry that's designed to kind of supplant corporate espionage in a digital way. And when we think about the future of warfare, it's not always just nukes and tanks, even though that will certainly still exist. Cyber attacks, looking at NotPetya, Russia deployed an attack called NotPetya to Ukraine years before the war, where it took out their internet and it took out their power, two critical things for critical infrastructure. Luckily, the Ukraine economy is not credit card based, they're cash based. So it didn't have a major impact. But imagine if that was just a practice run for a larger nation that is credit card or debit card or, cashless society. How would that impact our organizations? And how do we prepare for such an attack? So I would like to submit that understanding leads to change, right? Considering the bad actor behavior economics, understanding that this is big business, results in really to anticipate potential cyber threats. Understanding that this is a business to get data out of your organization may lead your organization to think differently about how they prepare for and plan responses to attacks. Secondly, understanding economic motivations driving cyber attacks results in optimized resource allocation. And I say that to mean that speaking to your executives about the fact that there are these organizations driving hacking into your organization because you have private health data, you have credit card information, you have, right, all of these things might change how the executives view your cybersecurity and your development teams, and may invest in additional resources for training, cross-training, and collaboration between the departments, or even combine them to maximize efficiency. Thirdly, insights into bad actor behavior analytics result in effective incident response strategy. So understanding what's happening around the globe, what are the signals of change, what is happening around the world could allow your organization to build more efficient responses and proactive responses to mitigate concerns, close those risks, patch those vulnerabilities, et cetera, to protect the organization better. So ultimately, the goal is to elevate security. I left my little levitating man here. One example to do so could be executive level awareness, promoting the awareness of security at an executive level, really highlighting and showing that this connection and the vulnerabilities of attacks is critical as a business function. And then secondly, looking at security by design. So incorporating security principles, mindsets, establishing parameters for what security should look like at a product level, at a business level, is critical to weed out the idea of pen testing after a promotion or a push or a release, as opposed to doing that before a release to remove or remediate any vulnerabilities. Hey,
So
Dennis,
Travis, just a quick one. The executive level awareness, one of the really cool things of doing those P3s as P1s is that you actually end up exposing a much wider number of execs on it. And because you also tend to explore what could happen next. And that's amazing for awareness. It's also awareness in context, because there's already something that has happened, right? So sometimes I've found that when you do awareness at executive level, because the original scenario is not that credible or that believable or that, I say, emotional connected to it, unless they already had that experience, it helps to have an anchor. And if you take P3s and run them at P1s or P2s, when you brief them or when you get them involved in incidents, they really understand it, right? They really go, oh, I can see, the problem. So it does wonders for executive level awareness. And more importantly, you create the relationships that you need to have in place, when, if you get a big one.
Absolutely. And a lot of times people highlight here, like security champions and other like programs like that. But I actually don't think that's enough. It needs to be incorporated into the core business, and the business itself needs to understand the security risks, which could mean downtime. It could mean offline. Recently, my wife and I went to Neiman Marcus, and they had a critical failure. All of their credit card machines went offline nationwide.
Yeah.
They could not, unless you had thousands of dollars in cash on you, you weren't buying anything from Neiman Marcus that day.
Yeah, can you
So,
imagine?
you know what I mean? Like a lot of organizations even think about redundancy. Some businesses I've seen have a backup internet provider. In case their internet provider goes down, they have another internet provider set up, ready to go, right? They have a backup network. They have active backup for identity access management, right? So having backups, having that plan in place. Now, if without that context, you speak to an executive about, well, I want to buy another internet provider. I want to buy another firewall. Well, what do you need that for? We have the first one.
Yeah. But you see, that's what's cool when you do it on top of an incident, because the question you ask is, okay, we got this incident, is contained or about to be contained, or we made good strides. But what should we do if this escalates here, if that escalates there? And as long as that line is credible, they really pay attention, and they should pay attention, because in some ways you should know that already. If you think about it, part of your incident response plan, your playbook, should be what happens if you get to this stage or get to that stage. The cool thing is that because you're coming on back of real incidents, it's not a theoretical question, right? It's like, I remember sitting down with a CEO once, and we mapped out on our e-commerce which websites we would shut down first. It's like, okay, if we're being attacked, or if you're having people for certain countries that we cannot really handle, which countries go down first? And it was very enlightening, because what he was giving us was his business priorities, right?
Yes.
To say, okay, guys, do this, but if you could leave these four countries alive, you're still protecting 80% of our revenue. Exactly. And that was really good, right? But then but that made wonders for his awareness, but also he understood the quality of our thinking, but also gave us a roadmap, right?
Yeah.
So cool. You're doing good here, man. I won't need to jump to the other session, but keep going, and I'm gonna make you the host so you can just stop recording at the end.
Okay, perfect. And I think just to highlight what you said, Dennis, basing it off of incidents is critical, but I think the value of foresight is that it doesn't have to be your incident it's based on. It can be another country's.
Oh, absolutely.
It can be something that happens someplace else in the world, but then you bring that back to your team and say, okay, this really did happen. Now let's look at how it happened in their organization and make sure it can't happen in ours, right? That's the beautiful piece of that. So, we just kind of talked through all three of these actually. Okay, so with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about harmonizing developer tools and security mindsets. We're all going to come together for one big family hug. Within the world of HCI, there's a concept of user-centered design, or UCD. I put the principles on the left, and it's a very basic principle. I think a lot of us use them, namely when we think about developer functions, they're coming from the understanding the user's needs, collaborating, getting the user to provide feedback on a design or a prototype, testing, and then making sure it's accessible for all users, and then you iterate, right? That's the consistent development process. Now, I'm positing that you apply UCD principles and consider security and privacy, not just as concepts, but actually as user personas. These personas have their own needs, behaviors, and expectations. So by empathizing with and incorporating privacy and security almost as users of your system, you can actually craft security features that align with the requirements align with what the business needs and aligns with what security is protecting against. There's a great intersection between these two. So when I look at ways that you can actually incorporate real world rituals that bring security and development together, the first thing that comes to mind is a business security review, right? Conduct regular and recurring security business sessions with senior leadership and executives to discuss known security threats, as Dennis was saying earlier, using incidents abroad and wide or that have recently happened in your organization. And this allows critical conversations to take place to build strategies and playbooks to safeguard products and feature releases ahead of something critical happening. Two, another option that comes to mind is joint workshops. And by this, I mean convening security and developers to collaborate and discuss real-world security threats and challenges. These workshops can include hands-on exercises, threat modeling, tabletop exercises, and brainstorming sessions to foster a shared understanding of security risks and solutions. And then thirdly, try to incorporate security-focused retrospectives from into the agile development process. And at the end of each sprint or development cycle, team can reflect on security-related successes and challenges, which fosters a culture of continuous improvement within the security of your organization. Let's see. So kind of with the final wrap up and takeaway here, I want to highlight, the goal is to harmonize the developer and security and to really protect and fortify. So ultimately, we have 3 steps to secure the development culture. The first one is to create a proactive security culture. Using Foresight, you can actually incorporate external threats, external signals of change, external threat actors, external incidents that you can then measure your organization against to make sure you're protected. 2, you can use the human-centered design principle and create security and privacy almost as a user, understanding your organization better, understanding the security protocols that are in place. Then when you're developing solutions for the business's problem for around its customers, you can incorporate privacy and usability and security as a user to match up against what the business is looking for to solve their problem. And then thirdly, I've highlighted a few ways that we can look for business to security alignment. If we're able to do that, then we're not developing first, then securing as an after the fact or afterthought. We're securing as we define the business requirements, and then when we develop, we're able to push confident that we have built successful solutions and successful plans to prevent and mitigate attacks. And really, I'm open for if there are any questions. Awesome. Okay. Thank you all so much. Oh, Michael, you have a question? Please come off mute. Okay, well, if then text your question, Michael. I've just asked you to unmute.
Yeah, I think that works. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so to kind of build upon where we can take real incidents and use them as ways of practicing. We also have when we do threat modeling of particular systems, always got an intuition for if this thing happened, then it would be really bad, or where we think we need to drive improvements. And in certain cases, it can be you get an external company to do some pen testing or to do some red team exercises to actually drive that, to actually go, cool. So basically create the incident to do that. So sort of building that in terms of scenario-based testing. Not sure if you've read the Kelly Shortridge book on security chaos engineering, but but essentially like what we're helping development teams to do is to build controls. And part of, did we do a good job at building a control is like, well, try and break it. So some of that is like, well, let's just break the control. And the thing that we're really worried about happening, and the thing that we really think we might have left some gaps, or that we want to see how we respond to that, is actually just poke it and test it and try and break it. The same, it might be like from resilience point of view, let's try and make that thing fall down. Have you seen that used
No, I'm not, but I'm actually on the
effectively, or
site
is
right
it like
now.
an evolution of it?
No, I mean, I'm familiar with the concept, but I just looked up the book. I'm going to have to grab it and read it. It's really exactly kind of what we're talking about, but it's a very technical approach. Absolutely. This is great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks. And then also, how do you, because you spoke about delayed gratification, and kind of talk about, like, obviously there's like hey, psychologists on YouTube who talk about it, and it's part of Stoics, and it's in meditations, and but it does kind of feel like the society that we live in right now is geared towards instant gratification. You do some shopping therapy, you buy stuff off Amazon, you order your taxi off of Uber, you order your pizza on a delivery app. Everything is kind of made to make everything as easy as possible for people to indulge in instant gratification.
And
Even
spend
even
money.
yeah, even down to how we use like social media and get likes and kind of stay within Facebook, or doom
Yeah.
scrolling on Reddit or something like that as well. So given that like society is kind of being engineered that way, and then you kind of got the wider backdrop of, hey, what do we do about the environment? We can see a trend there. We're not doing anything about it because like the instant gratification is we continue to consume and use stuff rather than delaying it and then actually going, let's work on the problem and embrace the hard work to sort the problem out. But within like a business context where it's always like release products, I want the value from the product now. Even if it's like, hey, we'll launch an MVP and it's sort of good enough to start extracting value, even though it might not be resilient, we might not have worked out, is it the most efficient way of making the cost? So you might go live at it and it's like, yeah, well, we didn't really optimize the infrastructure costs on that. We'll kind of do that as a follow-up, and that becomes like, we end up needlessly spending money potentially. So it's not always like just security and safety. There's like other reasons of basically like paying down technical debt. And like part of that is the delayed gratification is like, if you pay down the technical debt first, or kind of keep on top of it to a reasonable level. But how do you deal with that as I guess, a culture within the organization?
Right. So I think, the best way to describe that is that I think that's why that study was so profound to me, because, I've always kind of been a futurist. Like before I even went through the certification, I've always been thinking about the future, what I want, or in 5 years, 10 years, but that's not an innate skill. I've learned that. And I think that's why I always tell that story when I talk about foresight. It's not that I'm special or unique as much as I would love to be. It's that I've actually worked to build that particular prefrontal cortex around delayed gratification, around understanding my decisions today and my decisions tomorrow. We live in a very capitalistic society where, of course, immediacy generates this notion of buy now, right? We live in this scarcity mindset that we may not have it tomorrow. Let's spend it now. Let's, you know what I mean? Let's get it today. Let's get everything we can. Let's hoard it. So those are all the kind of indicative of our society, right? And the capitalist structure that we have around value, around monetary value, around pretty much everything, right? So in order to combat that within the organization, to start, right? Because that's not a value set, right? I mean, maybe there are different nations that may value that or see that as a different perspective. One example of that, and it's not a one-to-one, but I love how I think one of the Scandinavian nations, I want to say Denmark, but I'm not positive, they've created an industry around trash recycling. The idea that because there's so much trash produced by all of these different nations, they saw fit to build an industry and be able to pretty much allow other nations to sell them their trash. And then they'll go through and do the recycling, do the sorting, find out what can be recycled, produce, create industries, create products, create things out of other people's trash. And people are paying them to take their trash, to take their trash.
Yeah.
That to me is a foresight driven industry, because they're saying, hey, you have a problem, and it's still capitalistic in the sense that they're making money off of this, and they're creating jobs off of this, and they're creating products off of this. And I see this performed in a micro sense. I live in the state of Maryland in the US, and our county has recently created a composting like location. They've invested in a composting not warehouse, but factory, if you will. And they produce a good from collecting compost, which is free to us, which technically comes out of our tax money, right? So they come around every Monday, collect the compost, yard waste. I can recycle, egg shells and, old leftovers, special bags, whatever special trash can that they gave us. And then they produce a product that is a good fertilizer, and they're selling that to Home Depot and Lowe's and other manufacturers that goes into your lawn care. The idea that we're taking other people's trash and turning it into other goods, to me, is not inherently the traditional capitalist mindset of let's just make stuff out of plastic and then throw it away and then just figure out what to do with the trash later. So the idea that the concept of that delayed gratification, building that into your organization, it takes time. It has to become a value of the organization. It kind of has to come, either from the leadership or has to be pushed to the leadership to say, hey, if we continue down the road we're on, there's no way to know if we're going to survive. But if we start handling this tech deck now, even a little bit at a time, or if we start thinking about our next 2-3 moves, right? When you think about any chess master, they're probably 3 to 5 moves ahead in the game that they're playing. But that's because they've studied the game long enough to know what are the options, right? There's rules to every game, but understanding that and building in a future mindset and understanding, even if I have to throw this game, I'm prepared and know what to do in the next game. And I think sometimes we need to think about that a little bit better in business.
Yeah, I guess you then look at say China, Japan, and then they end up with like 100-year plans for their business, right? Or that, you look at I'm sure the ruling government in China, they, because they don't change, they don't keep swapping between Democrat and Republican every 4 or 5 years and then repealing what the previous leadership did. So they're kind of continuing on the same direction, and they're actually moving in the same direction the whole time because they're not kind of, like I said, flip-flopping between different leadership ideals all the time. I mean, because you mentioned about the sci-fi and the ideation, and when you were saying about the trash, I don't know if you watch Futurama, but there was like one of the Futurama episodes where they talked about sandwiches, and we're like, what am I eating? We're like, well, that sandwich is made from parts of other old sandwiches that people have thrown away. So it's like, again, like and that was probably like 20 years ago, I remember watching. So it's like all when sci-fi or, the whole Simpsons did it. So everything is predicted in Simpsons at some point. You can trace it back.
Exactly, right? But the idea that the arts and the creativity and the fictional can actually inform, our current state, inform a future state. And if we can harness some of that and be able to bring that into our organizations, we can kind of prevent and predict a lot of what's happening. I have a chart on another graph that talks about scenario development. And it's like this fan. It's like, here's what's probably most likely going to happen. And then here's what's, possible. Here's what's probable. Here's what's possible. Right. And we kind of fan out into these kind of branches. If you've watched Loki or any of the Disney shows around like time branching and how we look at that, the idea is that we don't always know, but we can create scenarios and test, especially with the injection of generative AI. There are, I think it was, I forgot what, McKinsey and Company or something like that. They did a they used AI to build models for a sailing team. I forget the name of the team. But they used AI to kind of create every possible scenario where they were going to be, right? They used all the data they could find around this particular sea or this particular stretch of the course and the race, the sail race. They were kind of created these scenarios, best case, worst case, all of them. And then they put the team in those situations and had them practice protocols for what to do on the boat if that situation arose. And I believe they actually won because they were the most prepared for any array of circumstances and situations that could arise on the boat.
Okay. So they're basically drilled for every eventuality that they found themselves in.
Exactly. But because they had statistics, they knew, right? It's not just I'm practicing 100 drills 100 times. I'm saying of the 100 possibilities, these 40 are the most prevalent based on the data, right? And then I can run those 40 400 times, right? As opposed to all 100, right? So like I can focus and concentrate my efforts around the most likely to happen based on all of the available data. And then by practicing those and absorbing an amount of times, I have a situational awareness and I have a mindset of, okay, if I do this now, that may impact this later on, right? So then they can start really thinking about the best way to get from point A to point B.
Okay, so kind of like NFL teams. So if like the Ravens are playing somebody else, they go like, right, what are we drilling this week? Well, who do we have up at the weekends? Well, these are the plays they normally run, so these are the ones we need to practice against. And then people try and throw in the wild cards to go like, we're going to throw in the new magic plays, which obviously if they're new, they're probably not able to predict it, not able to defend against it, and throw some curveballs.
Exactly. That is exactly right.
Cool. It was super interesting. Thank you.
Cool. No, thank you for being here. You have a great one.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.